Tonight we have a forum that I, for one, have long wanted. That is to say, a discussion on what should be the aims of the peace. Peace is never so easy to achieve as wars are to win. And we now enter the long period of trying to get out of the results of this war, some things that will last and change the troubled situation in the Middle East. Tonight we have a panel that I believe is very well suited to address that issue. Let me introduce you to them, starting with the right hand, my neighbour on my left-hand side. That is Mr. Yaakov Levy, who's the Consul General for Israel in Boston. He took his degree at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he was a teaching assistant for some time, before he joined the Foreign Service of Israel in 1970. In that capacity, he was for a while the consul in New York, and subsequently became Council Minister in Italy for the State of Israel, and then in 1983 returned home to Israel and became the Director of Public Affairs in that country. Recently, a couple of years ago, he came to Boston, where he is now the Consul General, and has been much engaged, he tells me, in the last few months, and indeed was likely to be engaged in the next few months, in discussing the whole question of the outcome of what is now the post-war situation in the Middle East. Next to Yaakov Levy is Freimat Duve, who is a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the German Bundestag, who is a spokesman particularly on issues of minorities and culture for the SPD, the German Social Democrats. He lives in Hamburg, and he's recently become the president of what is rather charmingly called the Working Group on the United States of the Social Democratic Fraktion. Next to him is, I'd like to see him, Nashut Masri, who is a Harvard College class of '92 undergraduate. He's very bravely agreed to come here as a citizen of Jordan, and he says also a citizen of Kirkland House. He has a thank you for the clack. He also happens to have a certain interest in what is going on at the present time, in that his father is Foreign Minister of Jordan. Next to him is Mr. Kurt Campbell, well known to you all, who is Assistant Professor of Public Policy and International Relations, Assistant Director of the CSIA, Centre for Science and International Affairs in this school, was Special Assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and on European and Soviet affairs, and I understand, having written 2 books and many articles, is now working on a book on military diplomacy. But luckily, I'm what's called an active participant spokesperson, so you're stuck with me for a couple of minutes before I turn to our panel. And I've done this because I think there are certain issues that we ought to try to address tonight. None of us are going to speak at great length. We're going to try to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. But there are some issues it's easy to overlook, and I just want to say a word or two about them, and maybe some members of our panel will decide to say something about them too. First then, let me say one word about lest we forget. It is, I think, striking that in 1982 Iraq was taken off the list of terrorist nations by the United States and many European powers. It is striking that in the summer of this last year, 1990, an attempt was made in Congress to ban the export of arms to Iraq. That bill finally got through Congress. It was supported by Congressman Howard Berman, Democrat of California. It finally got through Congress on August the 1st and was then opposed by the administration. Something else happened on August the 2nd. We ought to remember that we indicated, we the West, that Kuwait was not a great strategic interest to us. We ought to remember that most of us have a certain amount of shared guilt, all of us on this platform, for helping to build up the arms of Iraq, which we have now had to sacrifice our young men and women in attempting to stop. So I mention these things because it's easy to forget them. The effects of this war are partly our own responsibility. Then let's turn quickly to the problems we need to address. The first of those problems are what we should do right away. I would personally very much like to see a really major attempt by the Allies to get emergency aid and emergency medical supplies and emergency public health teams to help the victims. I think we could be on the edge of a major public health disaster, for example, in Baghdad. There are second steps. What can we do, and I hope our panel will discuss this, to limit another arms race starting all over again? It's already beginning. Already there are beginning to be new arms sales to countries in the Middle East who are only too likely to produce the same problems another 5 or 7 years down the road. I hope our panel will have something to say about that. Is there any possibility of a regional security structure? The Csce, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, has been remarkably successful in burying many of the after effects of the Cold War. Is any such structure conceivable in the Middle East? Fourthly, what kind of economic structure should we think about? Because there are wide gaps between very poor Arabs in the region and very wealthy Arab states. And part of the trouble in the region is that the poverty of the very poor and the wealth of the Gulf states bear no relationship to one another. And finally, what can be done about the long-term historic divisions and rivalries within the region, which so often have brought it to the edge of crisis and dispute and war? Those may not be the questions that my panel wants to address, but I hope that at least some of them will have something to say on those issues, and I very much hope the audience will too. It's a great pleasure tonight, therefore, to turn first of all to Freimut Dove of the German Foreign Affairs Committee to speak about how he sees the aims of the peace after the war. Freimut.
Thank you very much, Shirley. I must start with a word on Germany, because a lot of people in my country and in your country and in Britain and France really question the role of Germany in this crisis. And I must personally say I'm not ashamed about the fact that Germany, after unification, and due to its own experience and assessment of the situation, did not send troops. I have not the time to explain. Maybe I can explain it later. But I do feel ashamed, and you mentioned that in a rather ugly way, we are in the conflict, we Germans, with regard to the chemical arms on the side of the software. The former GDR had trained the Iraqi soldiers to be able to use them against the Kurds. And on the hardware side, it were German people, not the German people, but German citizens, who helped to have the stuff. And there is some dispute on the Germans, on Germans, to help to make the Scuds fly longer distances. So we are in it in the one way or the other. And we certainly are in it in sharing the financial burden. The Germans did not say we are not going to be one of those who pay for all the costs. And so certainly Germany and Europe, within the framework of Europe, should play a role in all those questions you asked. I do think there are, in the ruins of this catastrophe, and I do think it is a catastrophe, there are some bright elements. There are some elements out of which one could envisage peace, and I think Europe should play a role. Now, with regard to your precise questions, Germany is willing and prepared in immediate help on the present dangers, health hazards, etc. But I think especially we should put great emphasis on the environmental hazards and the things to be done immediately, the burning of the oil sites and all the hazards connected to that. This central topic we want to play a part in is the question of whether we do this the game again. To be nice to Iraq because we didn't want to be nice to Iran, to be nice to Syria with regards to arms, or to be nice to somebody who is now on our side and maybe tomorrow will go into the same game again. I think this crisis must be the crisis in which we learn in one way or the other to curb the arms race and to curb arms exportation. There's great effort being made on behalf of our parliament. I hope so of our government. As you know, I am in the opposition, to have our share in this. But if I see the discussion in some countries and in my own country of future markets, about future markets, I always see that the whole thing might start again. And some people, some industries see this war as a good and new opportunity to start the whole thing all over again. And I think that is the central issue which we must concentrate on. Are our economies ready to change the structure of military industry? Are we able to really control arms export? As you know, Iraq was the second largest importer in this world, India being the largest. And it is no consolation for a German that Germany is only the fifth or the sixth exporter. We all have to have a common policy, including Russia, including Czechoslovakia. We all built up this military machinery which would have not become a danger to anybody, whatever Hitlerite leadership they would have had if we wouldn't have given him the weaponry and the arms, and if we wouldn't have wouldn't have had all the political arguments to do so against the fundamentalists in Tehran. Economic structure. I do think that a Helsinki-type process would allow for a process in which the question of recognition of one side or the other, recognition of the Israeli right to be there and the Palestinian right, could be postponed, the recognition question, and we would have to tackle other immediate questions before and try to get all parties concerned without having them recognize one another in the field of oil revenues in the region, the water question in the region. Is it possible to have a regional water conference under the auspices of the United Nations, for example? The Palestinians, as much as the Israelis, are dependent on a water solution. And let me say the final thing. I think there's one point of strong debate and even dispute between the way Europe reacted to the first oil crisis in '73, restructuring the way of consuming oil in our own economies, and the United States. If the myth is not broken up that oil is not a military good anymore, that there's enough oil, and that oil should rather be expensive in order to restructure economy and not too cheap. If we don't tackle this and debate this, have a debate on this, I think we are in for another type of conflict without necessity. There's no necessity to fight a war on oil anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Freimut. Our next speaker is Nasri And I'll pass the table over to him.
Can we use the podium?
Of course, absolutely. If you want to use the podium, you're very welcome. Anybody can choose as they wish.
No, that's okay. Can you hear me? No. Something. All right. There you go. Okay. I will sort of I will cover in my speech, I have a prepared speech, I will cover some of the issues that the professor raised earlier. Let me introduce myself in Arabic. My name is Nash'at al-Masri. I will be making a few remarks on behalf of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan tonight and what I think people in the kingdom would like to see in the future of the Middle East. Coincidentally, I will be covering a lot of the issues that specifically that you even raised. Now, I will bore you with history for 1 minute. People in the region, as you know, have been suffering for decades. The region being a source of tension, continued tension. And in my mind, the predominant issue in the region's life has been the Arab-Israeli conflict with the Palestinian issue at its core. And as you know, to date, all gestures, all attempts to alleviate us of this chronic illness have failed. The Jordanian reaction to the crisis has been colored primarily, I believe, by the grievances resulting from the Palestinian issue. Saddam emerged as a leader willing to stand up to Israel, to the West, not just with rhetoric, but with an army and the willingness to use it. The Jordanians and Palestinians, their dignity suffering and frustrations running very high, fell into his arms. They saw him as a man who would bolster both their position on and off the negotiating table, as well as on a psychological level. Of course, the introduction of foreign troops into the region in August, September, and the continuing escalation contributed further complicated matters. Now, there's a misconception since the early days of the crisis that Jordan has sided openly with Iraq. Now, I don't deny that there is overwhelming public support for Iraq. However, I do want to say that the government has maintained a neutral position, and it has not condoned the invasion. It has asked for the implementation of international law and for the withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwait. I'd also mention as a case in point that we have been dealing with the Kuwaiti ambassador in Jordan as a legitimate representative of the Kuwaiti government. We have tried as best we could to implement UN economic sanctions, and I'll mention that that was at a cost of 40% of our exports. 40%. We have managed to persevere in this position despite popular sentiment, which has been strongly supportive of Iraq. Now, the main concern for the Jordanian government has been to maintain law and order in the country, and as long as passionate hearts rule over minds in Amman, this will continue to be our main concern in the immediate future. Because of this current instability, and because we are in the middle of a democratic experiment, I think it is very important for the king to sort of maintain a very high profile in support of public sentiment. And I think that a lot of the statements that he made appear to have been an attempt to control this domestic front. Now, the future, I guess, after this short foray into the past. We would like to see a new world order based on, especially more specifically, a new regional order based on two very important principles: the idea that a permanent resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and a narrowing of the vast disparity between the rich and the poor Arabs. And I think that these two are the two essential components, and I will sort of elaborate a bit on each. A viable and durable settlement has to be agreed upon and promoted from within the region through regional reconciliation, which means not just an easing of the tension between the Arabs and Israel, but also an easing of the tension between the Arabs themselves. And I think there must be provisions for equal and mutual guarantees of rights of states, no matter who they may be. And the work that should begin now to finding the proper format is unclear, but the Csce, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that Professor Williams mentioned was what, in fact, I was going to talk about a little bit. This was it started in 1975 in Helsinki, and it was the cornerstone for the building of a new European identity with the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, as well as the Western countries. Now, the conference helps to concentrate on common factors such as human rights and freedoms. The final meeting of the Csce in Paris in 1990, well, I'm sorry, it's not the final meeting, that's a mistake on my part, but that particular meeting in Paris in 1990 ended the Cold War, and I think that something along those lines could be started. When I say the Csce, I don't believe it should be a framework for a security arrangement, but more in terms of a regional network of health and trade improvement and cooperation. A UN-sponsored peace conference would aim at dealing with the broader political, economic, and security issues. And I believe that such a conference would have to reiterate its support for the United Nations resolutions 242 and 338, the Land for Peace formula. Also, another issue that we were talking about is arms control, and I believe that this UN conference should deal with disarmament and arms control, specifically creating a zone in the Middle East free of weapons of mass destruction. And also what would be a pretty good idea is if we could limit conventional weapons, much in the way that NATO and the Warsaw Pact have been doing recently. Now, the second major objective after a just peace would be economic progress. And one of the factors, one of the sources of Saddam's support has been the sort of the north-south debate among the Arabs, the vast disparity between the rich and the poor Arabs. An inter-Arab conference may consider ideas regarding setting a Middle East development structure to achieve a substantial narrowing of economic gaps between its parts, a reallocation or a more just allocation of financial resources. I'm not here suggesting that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait should liberally hand out money and grant money, etc., etc. I'm more talking along the lines of a Middle Eastern Bank for Reconstruction, much like the European Bank for Reconstruction, or which has been set up in Europe to help the Eastern Bloc leave its command economy and enter into more of an open economy, market economy structure. Now, the Middle Eastern Bank would operate in a similar method. It would obtain its funds from a serious commitment by those Arab states that could afford to place money in the fund. And these funds would then go to the more needy Arab states and in the form of long-term loans to the industrial base of those countries, which would hopefully be able to, in the long run, repay those loans. I've mentioned that there exists the Kuwaiti fund and the Abu Dhabi fund. I think that those are a step in the right direction, but too little. And finally, the Arab countries should undertake a thorough review of the Arab structures that already exist, the Arab League. The Arab League was conceived to be a dynamic, powerful, versatile organization, and it failed to translate this theoretical power into real ability. And the reason for that has been a lack of commitment to it by a majority of the Arab states, frankly. There were plans for a customs union, like the European Community, among the Arabs, and yet nobody moved on it on the political front. Now, democracy and respect for human rights, I'm just going to read this part. Democracy and respect for human rights must occupy a central part in the future of the region. Security and development cannot be sustained in the absence of democracy and the accountability of governments, or at the expense of human dignity. And I'd like to emphasize again that that applies to everybody. I mean, whether it be the Iraqis or the Kuwaitis, the Palestinians, the Israelis, the Lebanese. I'm proud to say, in closing, that Jordan has been one of the few Arab states that has undertaken an attempt at democratization. And I'm very proud to also say that so far it has been a success. So security in the form of a just and durable peace with the Arabs and with Israel, and the recognizing of all the rights of all human beings to self-determination, and a more equitable distribution of financial, economic resources. These are Jordan's aims for stability in the region and for a lasting peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masri. I now call upon Jacob Levy, who is the Consul General for Israel in Boston, to speak next. Jacob? Yes, please do.
Good evening and shalom. Salam. Indeed, I'm tempted to cast away my prepared remarks and to address but one of the subjects which our moderator suggested, and that is settling historical rivalries. How? And at the risk of being non-academic, I would approach a very simple solution. It's one of the first times where I've had the opportunity to sit with an Arab colleague on a panel. And if I may address you, Mr. Masri, and say, if you and I, if our colleagues, Arab and Israelis, could sit together at conferences, at panels and meetings, deliberate the issues, in a sense the way it's done today, perhaps a lot of the problems which we have in the region would really be settled. But being in an academic forum, I'd like to make a more deliberate presentation on the question of, or some remarks on settling historical rivalries, and touch upon the few other suggestions you made as far as topics. A week after the ceasefire, the temporary ceasefire in fact, is a good opportunity for stock taking as far as where we stand today. Because after every war in the Middle East, there was a sense, a feeling that a window of opportunity had opened up, if for a brief period of time. And if one seizes upon it, perhaps some progress could be made in the direction of reconciliation between at least rivalries in one conflict in the region, that is the Arab-Israeli one, on which I'll focus my remarks. Take, for example, 1956. After the war, there was a brief opportunity and a limited agreement was reached, or rather guarantee, for freedom of navigation, and UN forces were stationed between Israel and Egypt, an agreement which was effective for 10 years, but at the first serious crisis really crumbled, that is in 1967. In 1967, during the war, and in its immediate aftermath, there was a greater sense of opportunity which lasted about 3 months between the time the famous United Nations Resolution 242 was adopted, which didn't just speak about the question of what Israel has to surrender, that is some territories, but also addressed the other side, the need for peace and recognition of Israel by Arab parties. And that window of opportunity remained open for about 3 months until the famous summit in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, I think in September, which adopted the famous 3 no's, no peace with Israel, no recognition of her, and no negotiations with her. In 1973, it seemed that a great window of opportunity opened, especially because the war ended in a kind of stalemate for reasons upon which I won't have time to elaborate. 1973 seemed to create leverage for arrangements between Arabs and Israelis. And indeed, with the Syrians, we reached a very limited agreement in June 1974, an agreement which basically has been holding for the last 17 years. While with Egypt, the 73 war opened a series of arrangements, if you recall, separation of forces, ceasefire, an interim arrangement, the Sadat visits to Jerusalem, the negotiations at Camp David in 78, the peace treaty in 79, through its implementation in 82. That is 8 or even 9 years of negotiations, one building on the other, based in a sense on this window of opportunity which opened up. Now, of course, the war between Iraq and the rest of the world community, if you will, is different than any previous Arab-Israeli conflict for a prime reason that Israel has not been a direct and formal party to the conflict. But still, people might draw some kind of parallels, at least as far as moving ahead might be considered. And we do have the sense in Israel and the expectation, perhaps being too optimistic, that old perceptions might crumble, that the crisis in inter-Arab relations, as illustrated also here tonight in a sense, the invasion of Kuwait, the, in a sense, disappearance of the Arab League for the last 6 or 9 months, the creation of limited interim arrangements with outside parties for the purpose of the pursuit of the war, that they are kind of creating an opportunity for realliance, for the creation and emergence of a new axis in the Arab world, led hopefully by Egypt, followed by the parties to the coalition, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the oil countries, perhaps even Syria. An axis which would lead the Arab world in the direction which Egypt had tried to lead it in the 70s, into a process of negotiation and accommodation with Israel, into a process which would remove them from conflict and confrontation. And in this sense, one of the main components, we would hope, of rethinking in the Middle East would be the need to address the arms race, especially the conventional one, because all wars in the Middle East have been fought with massive quantities of conventional arms. The hope which we harbor, at least at this point, of not beginning once more the cycle of armament and rearmament, which in a sense is tied in to many other elements mentioned in this program. That is, the haves and the have-nots, the need for economic development, because if you spend billions and billions on arms, like Iraq did, and it's self-evident now, then you cannot address all these inequities and problems at any time in the conceivable future. The situation now could be ripe, in a way, for abandoning old concept in Arab-Israeli relations. For example, there is still a permanent state of war between all Arab states and Israel, save Egypt. Isn't this a good opportunity to erase this formal state of war, which has been with us since 1948? There is opposition to recognition of Israel in every forum. Only Egypt recognizes Israel. 20 other Arab states, I might say including Jordan, still refuse to come to terms with this conceptual barrier, which is the recognition of Israel as being there, independent of whatever conflict you might have with her and whatever positions you might have. Just the recognition that Israel has a right to be there, and then settle and address all the other issues. The desisting from the annual initiative, which is still underfoot, of denying Israel's credentials at the United Nations General Assembly, which is over, but the move is still pending. An agreement, and here I return to my opening remarks, for direct negotiations with Israel. What is the most normal course of event for a neighboring country like Jordan but to sit together with us face to face and begin resolving our differences? And we could touch on any issue: sovereignty, borders, territory, arms limitation, economic cooperation, sharing of water resources, you name it. You can mention 20 areas, including the 5 or 6 on the agenda which our moderator pronounced at the beginning. The establishment of diplomatic relations. How do we settle differences of opinion with Egypt today? In the normal way in which Canada and the United States address their differences. And some of our differences with Egypt over the last decade have been serious. But still, we'd call in the Egyptian ambassador, or our ambassador would be invited for a démarche at the Egyptian Foreign Ministry. But in the past, for a generation, we settled these differences on the battlefield. The end of economic boycotts. We were talking about the possibility of a bank, of a system of economic reconstruction. There is still an economic boycott of Israel, of no trade with her, of no trade with companies that do business with Israel, a boycott which has been enforced as early as 1946. There is, of course, a major issue of the Palestinians, which, of course, divides Israelis and Arabs and was related to in the remarks of my Jordanian colleague. Yes, indeed, it is a major obstacle. But I think in that sense, our emergence from the crisis in the Gulf could shed some positive light on it, in the sense that the most radical force in the Palestinian camp, namely the PLO and Arafat, have lost a lot of ground, first and foremost, it seems, in the Arab world, and then in the international community. One of the obstacles to making progress over the last 2 years on the question of the Palestinians was, in our judgment, the insistence that the PLO be brought into the negotiations. And you know that the PLO for Israelis is a non-starter. Our feeling now, that as they've lost credence in the Arab world, is that it might just be possible that other Palestinian leadership, especially in the territories, the West Bank and Gaza, could emerge and would be willing to sit and negotiate with us. The United States has a lot of new capital in the Arab world as a result of the alliance it forged against Saddam Hussein. You know that the United States has been instrumental in bringing about all the agreements we've had with Egypt and also with Syria in 1974. We would hope that the visit of Secretary Baker to the area would indeed be the first step in the direction of channeling some of this goodwill in the direction of accommodation and negotiations with Israel. And in that sense, we'd be happy to work with the United States on a two-track approach. One is Israel and the Arab states, direct negotiations, resolving the differences still existing between us along some of the lines I mentioned before and many others. The second track would be Israel and the Palestinians. And in that sense, we would hope that with the losing of power, with the loss of power which the PLO has suffered, that other Palestinians would be willing to come and talk with us within the framework perhaps of the Israeli initiative of some 2 years ago. But at the same time, in conclusion, I would like to touch upon other elements, the non-political ones, in the agenda set for us for this evening. Wouldn't it be possible, even with the political differences which still exist between Israelis and Arabs and the historic rivalries which are still there, wouldn't it be possible perhaps to address some of the easiest subjects which are common to all of us and which have become perhaps more pronounced during this crisis? The question of the environment, of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, which is dear to all of us and which has suffered a lot during this crisis. The scarce water and energy and economic resources in the region. I would submit to you that were Israelis and Arabs sitting together in these kind of conferences, the way, in a sense, the way we're seated today, addressing issues perhaps in which the sensibilities and sensitivities are less acute, in which perhaps we could reach positive accommodation and cooperation, wouldn't it then be easier to approach the other tracks of conflict which still face us, that is the Palestinian issue and the differences between Arabs and Israelis? And I would say that the sense of Israelis is that perhaps today, when the Middle East emerges from this terrible crisis in the Gulf, with the casualties and the losses which we all suffered, that perhaps the opportunity, the timing is right for us to seize the moment to sit together on all these planes, the non-political ones, the problems we all share, and perhaps the differences between Arabs and Israelis, which could be addressed with a spirit of accommodation and negotiations rather than conflict and confrontation, the way countries and nations in the Gulf faced each other in recent months.
Thank you very much, Yaakov. Kurt Campbell is our final speaker before we open up to questions. Kurt.
Thank you, Shirley. Very quickly, I'm going to make a couple of comments about what we might expect from the American or U.S. government approach beginning perhaps next week with Secretary of State Baker's move to the region. Now, I'm going to begin with just a few remarks about some anthropological or cultural observations about government, particularly as it relates to the Gulf at this stage. We've seen over the last several months a waning, so to speak, of bureaucratic influence of Secretary of State Baker in favor of his more militant comrades, so to speak, across the river in the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Cheney and his Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell. That process is about to end, and we're now going to see the return of James Baker. In the sense, he has positioned himself over the last several months, working very carefully with his staff and others in Washington, preparing for exactly this moment, what happens after the success of the Gulf War. And there are a couple of other interesting observations, again, from almost an anthropological perspective. There are two battling empires in the foreign policy community in the United States government, particularly in the State Department. There are the Europeanists and there are the Middle Eastern specialists, and there's a delicate balance of power that exists between the two of them. They're often distrustful of each other, and they've had varying degrees of power and influence over the last 25 or 30 years in the U.S. government. The interesting thing since about 1988 has been the rise of the Europeanists in power and persuasion around President Bush, and there are obvious reasons for that. Specifically has been where the action has been until very recently has been in Europe, with the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, movements on arms control, very important negotiations and agreements with Eastern European states, with Europe, and also with the Soviet Union. Now, the interesting thing, when the attention shifted in government towards the Gulf after August 2nd, the group of people in power that were actually more responsible for the formulation and execution of U.S. policy towards the Gulf and the Middle East were not the Middle Eastern specialists. Indeed, you might have expected that the Middle Eastern specialists would have again rise in prominence in shaping U.S. foreign policy, but that was not the case. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Many of the Middle Eastern specialists, the most prominent ones in U.S. government, were those several years before who had argued it was in U.S. interest to tilt towards Iraq in the policy of the Gulf in terms of the Iran-Iraq war. The interesting thing, one of the tragedies of government, one of the only outspoken opponents of that approach was Ambassador Gillespie, who was, in fact, has been singled out, so to speak, as the lesson in terms of the one who took the wrong approach, appeasing Saddam Hussein. Anyway, it's important to look for a second at these two groups and their approach to these issues in terms of how they might look at the Gulf. And I think it's important here to remember that even though the Gulf and European history, you couldn't imagine two regions that are as dissimilar. In fact, it would be very dangerous to apply lessons from the European context to the Gulf. There will be an attempt, I think, to appropriate some of the language and approaches of the last several years to the issues in the Gulf. And specifically, what I'm referring to is a more functionalist approach, which has, again, seen some success in the European context. The attempt to use confidence and security building measures off and away from the negotiating table to try to bring about some progress before you attack the very high-end issues, the questions of recognition, etc. Middle Eastern specialists tended in the past to look at the region through a balance of power perspective. Let's balance Iraq off with Iran. Let's look at certain kinds of forces within the region. The tools here obviously were arms sales. Now I think one of the things that we're going to find subsequently is that that approach is now bankrupt, and we're going to see a more functionalist approach in terms of trying to tackle the problems of the region over the long term. Now let me very specifically, or actually with the time I have remaining, identify for you what are the 4 or 5 baskets, and again, the appropriation of language. Baskets were the terms used for the European dialogue between East and West and how it's appropriated in the Gulf region. And just for a second, I would say no one should be under any misapprehension about the difficulties in applying this sort of framework. Clearly, you have more than 2 camps, so to speak. I mean, contrary to some of the suggestions we've heard on the panel, this was not an Arab-Israeli war. This was a war between Arab states in the region. And we must keep that really foremost in our minds when looking at how we tackle the region subsequently. Secretary of State Baker has made it very clear that he wants to look at 4 or 5. He wants to divide the issues that he's concerned with into 4 or 5 camps. And I think we're seeing actually the process of adding a 6th group of baskets, so to speak, in terms of how the United States will approach the region. One of the things that's clear from a couple of the speeches that he has given is the notion that, of course, as we've heard, that the United States has a brief period of very high political capital in the region and a short window of opportunity in which to act. And there are many reasons for this. But one thing that must not be miscalculated is the sense of confusion in all capitals, from Israel everywhere in the region. This has shaken some of the primary political foundations and military assumptions of each of the governments, and I'll run through that very quickly. But the 4 or 5 issues that Secretary of State Baker will be looking at as he approaches the region. One will be the whole question, we've heard about this, a regional reconstruction development group, something that is supported by a variety of states in the region, including Iran. And the model for this, frankly, will be something along the lines of the Texas Railroad Commission in the 1930s, in which you try to, again, take from the rich robber barons and then reapportion in the region. And the goal will be to redistribute wealth and perhaps resources from the more powerful Arab states to Jordan and Egypt in particular. And I think you will see wide agreement on this, and we've heard some very positive statements coming from Japan and Germany on specifically these issues. Of course, the fear is, from the American perspective, is that the United States has been involved in destroying the region, and Japan and Germany will be involved in rebuilding it. What does that look like? I mean, it looks like we're not practicing a very careful form of diplomacy. A second approach will be an attempt, a much more serious attempt at regional security cooperation, perhaps using the Gulf Cooperation Council, regenerating it, and also making very clear a role for Iran in this forum. Iran has been an important observer in the last 2 years, and I think Secretary of State Baker has made very clear that there will be and there should be a role for Iran within the context of the Gulf region. And you will see a subtle attempt on the part of the State Department to differentiate between the Gulf region and the Middle East. There are Middle Eastern concerns and there are Gulf concerns. And clearly the Gulf Cooperation Council will attempt to apply certain aspects of confidence and security building measures and other things, sharing of resources to the GCC plus Iran. A third issue, obviously the one that's perhaps most important, is the Arab-Israeli dialogue. And I think, again, we've heard Secretary of State Baker and also President Bush say that they will proceed along two different. There will be an attempt to get indigenous dialogue going between Jews and Palestinians, and there will also be an attempt within the region to begin dialogue between Arab and Israeli states. I think the latter one has more possibility of success at this juncture, and I think one of the interesting things that we haven't had discussed in any detail is what happened during the war. In fact, there was some very interesting and important communication, military communication, between the Allied coalition and Israel on a variety of different fronts, and the hope is that some of that can extend into this new environment of peace. We can talk about this issue in much greater detail. What other levers or possibilities that Baker might bring to the region possibly could be a commitment for the United States to take in more immigrants, both from the Soviet Union and Israel, in the short term, if necessary. And again, there's quite a bit of debate about this. We've already heard from the Soviets and the Germans of their interest in convening some form of UN meeting about the whole Middle Eastern question. And I think that is a subject that Baker has not ruled on or has not taken a view about, but he will take it to the region in the next several days, and we'll have a better understanding, I think, on this issue soon. Clearly, all the other issues in this format have been widely discussed. The question about how to proceed on this most crucial issue has been held very closely by Secretary of State Baker and the people around him. Let me just conclude very quickly here, Shirley. I'm sorry to go on, but arms control will also be an approach in the region. Now, there are a wide variety of possibilities. One might be a nuclear approach or biological or chemical. I think the view is that each of these are so hopelessly over-optimistic at this stage to begin on something that perhaps will have a public resonance for the short term. And I think the key is to begin with conventional weapons, and not low-end weapons, not tanks or artillery, but perhaps high-end weapons, specifically missiles. And the key here, I think, will be an attempt to convince all the states in the region how the advent of these weapons to the region has changed the entire calculus. Clearly, the debate that's going on in Israel right now is that the conventional notions of how to defend yourself are now open for very serious consideration. Israel, in this situation, could not defend itself. No, even if they had sent their fighters early on, very little would have been accomplished. Initiative and the threat of massive retaliations have been the two pinnacles of Israeli strategy. And clearly the problem with missiles in the region, or delivery vehicles that can bring chemical weapons or whatever at a very short period of time, changes that calculus very clearly. And I think an attempt will be made in the United States to convince countries in the region why certain kinds of imposed arms control regimes might make sense. In this sense, I think we will have to work within the context of our European allies and also the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and others to try to get an agreement to stop the sale of conventional missiles, even low-end missiles, to the region, and perhaps even towards a longer-term agreement about how to preclude the development of them indigenously. Of course, there are I can sit here and name all the reasons why this is so difficult, but I think there at least will be an attempt to isolate these issues specifically in the short term. And the last issue, or the last two issues, one, international and multilateral military involvement in the region. There will be an attempt to get a longer-term agreement for an American and British and perhaps larger Arab or peacekeeping forces in the region for a variety of purposes. One, we clearly will need some form of peacekeeping option available, not so much to protect Kuwait from Iraq, but for public safety inside of Kuwait over the short run. That's clearly going to be a necessity. Public order will be a concern there for the next 6 months to perhaps 2 years. I think there are already some fairly advanced negotiations underway about certain kinds of naval operations, joint training of troops, and prepositioning of materials, and also some air cooperation in terms of fighter aircraft. But clearly, what's missing from this list and what's been added subsequently is this whole question about the interrelationship between domestic reform and international behavior. And that has been probably the most important lesson that the Europeanists bring to this whole process, is that undemocratic states wage war. And there's a clear historical evidence for that, particularly in the European context. And I think it's going to be a very delicate issue for the United States to handle, particularly in the context of our allies, like Saudi Arabia and others, who've made it very clear that they're concerned about the fact that the presence of American troops inside their country has acted as a catalyst, setting off a conflict between the conservative reformers and more Islamic fundamentalists inside of Saudi Arabia that are very concerned about the presence of American troops within the region. And I think we have indications from a variety of Gulf states that when we are out of there, that their intention is to turn up the screws and to again repress. Clearly, a case might be made, and I think it will be, for a process of democratic form, the case study being in Kuwait. We're already beginning to see that the resistance leaders, much more established than we had imagined inside of Kuwait, are very concerned about the return of the old order. And one of the reasons that there has been no return of the emir is because I don't think anyone can guarantee their safety. And that raises a lot of questions about some form of international group that will be used to try to somehow see a transition, and where we might see a much more strengthened role for a parliamentary group within Kuwait. Now, I'm just completing here. So again, I would say that what we will see in the coming days and weeks will be a concerted American attempt to launch the agenda in Europe and also within the context of the Middle East. I think there's enough there to make everyone unhappy, and it clearly will be extremely unpopular at all capitals. However, I think what the administration is banking on, again, is this short period of opportunity on which the United States can hope to build. I think I'll leave it at that, and then hopefully we can open it up for some discussions.
When Kurt was speaking, I was reminded of the way in which the Council of Europe reimposed conservative governments all over Europe after defeating Napoleon. And there are some rather disturbing parallels one might think about if the United States is told to get on with that particular task. We've got time for questions, and I'd be delighted to recognise the first questioner. When you ask a question, could you say your name, and could you also say if there's a particular member of the panel that you want to address that question? It's very helpful if you could give us some idea who you'd like to reply. Yeah, could you come up to mics? It's a big help to the television people. If anybody wants to ask a question, there's a mic here, there's another one there, and if you don't mind coming up to the mic, I'd be very grateful. Right, sir.
Good evening. My question is directed to...
Can you give us your name first? It's just for the
My name
record.
is Olivier de Schutter. My question is directed to Mr. Levy. I was wondering if you could tell us what was the difference between the refusal of the Arabs to speak with the Israeli government and, on the other hand, the refusal of the Israeli government to speak with the PLO. How do you deny the right of the Palestinian people to choose their own representative, and do you believe there is somebody else capable of representing the Palestinian people?
Mr. Levy, and if anybody else wants to add to that, they're very welcome on the panel.
Can you hear me? Yes. I would question the premise behind your question, which is that the PLO necessarily represents the Palestinians, based on the fact that never was the PLO elected, but rather imposed itself on the Palestinians. Israel is ready to talk with representatives of the Palestinian people, and Israel thinks that the best way of determining who would represent them is to have free and democratic elections, the way we have it in Israel, the way you have it over here. And in a sense, it ties in with the observation of the recent panelists of the need to introduce some kind of gradual process of democratization into the area. Because I do subscribe to the opinion that part of the problems we have with our neighbors is that most of them do not share a system of democratic representation, and therefore the will of one person, one leader, or a small coterie of leaders would be imposed on whole countries and would lead them to war and conflict. And I would assume that had there been a greater process of representation, the conflicts in the Middle East would be, if not eliminated, at least reduced. So to sum up, our position is, yes, we'll talk to Palestinians, we'll talk to an elected delegation of the Palestinian people, and had it been up to us, the elections could have very well been held 2 years ago. But it's not too late. The window of opportunity now provides us with two options which could be embarked upon in a parallel manner. Israel and the Arab states, and at the same time Israel and the Palestinians. Who to talk to? The elected delegation of the Palestinians, and elections from our point of view could be held in the coming weeks or months.
Freimuth Duve.
Yes, I agree to your point that it might be very, very difficult for the Israeli public to accept talks with the PLO, but I think this must be one point asked for now. I remember visiting Ali Yad, who was murdered some months ago in the PLO headquarters, and he was murdered because he was opposing the alliance of Arafat with Saddam Hussein during the crisis. And what he said to Norbert Gansel and myself, who visited him, he said, we might be the last generation of Palestinians who are in for peace and who want negotiation and who want a settlement. And we don't see, I'm quoting him, we don't see any other group within the territories who have fought so long to get a peaceful settlement. I know that it is difficult, both sides. I know the history of terrorism, but I think if the Palestinians have to overcome a lot of things now, Israel must be ready to overcome its radical position vis-à-vis people who don't live on the West Bank and who have organized themselves as refugees outside. They had a very difficult 40 years behind them, and I think there should be accepted, and I think it is with maybe a new leadership of the PLO, which might come up now. Israel must change its view vis-à-vis the Palestinians.
Kurt Campbell.
A general point here, and I think we might take a lesson from Mikhail Gorbachev, not a lesson you might imagine, but it's interesting to look at his diplomacy of the mid-1980s when perestroika was still fresh and there were lots of hopes and promises for the future. It was clear that the United States and the Allies, in building our coalitions and thinking about arms control, had built an entire house of cards in terms of our diplomatic approach to the Soviet Union, because we built it on the assumption that the Soviet Union would always say no to a variety of different things. That included the elimination of certain weapons, that included on-site verifications, a wide variety of different things. And the first time that Gorbachev said yes, it sent the United States and the alliance on a tizzy. It is a lesson that those in the region should learn. If, for instance, I mean, it strikes me that in all fairness, and this is a natural thing, but Israel has built a very, very powerful front on what it would be prepared to do if an Arab state would recognize it. I would bet you that if an Arab state took the initiative of deciding to take a bold diplomatic initiative, it would immediately put Israel on the defensive and would force them to really rethink actually what's in their own best interests. But it would begin the process. Likewise, for the PLO, I think it might make sense for if you look, and it's always dangerous to make analogies, but look at what has happened in South Africa vis-a-vis the government and the ANC. It's not a representative organization. It's not democratically elected, but President de Klerk has achieved tremendous credibility and has put the ANC on a defensive it has never been on in history by acknowledging them, by agreeing to discuss with them. His position is stronger domestically than it probably ever has been, and the community is more divided, i.e. the ANC is more divided than at any time in its history. In fact, he did exactly the sort of thing that almost has led to the dissolutionment of the organization. And I would argue that the PLO is held together along the same lines. And a certain form of recognition could send this, or at least not recognition, but agree to talk, could send the organization back to a very precarious time of actually having to face openly these very difficult issues and tensions.
Anything you want to add, Mr. Masri?
Well, I'll just make it very brief. I think the two gentlemen around me have said a lot of what I want to say, but I'd like to, and I don't want to open a can of worms here, I'd like to just say that the PLO did take a very, very important and very dangerous step for it in saying that its charter its charter is null and void, so to speak, a form of going a step closer to Israel, and a step that really alienated a lot of Palestinians, a very dangerous step for which it really got nothing in return from Israel. The United States sort of helped it out, began talking with it, but at that period of time it got nothing in return from Israel, and it made that what seemed back then as a very superhuman effort on their part. I think that both sides need to approach each other more, but I think that the PLO sort of began with that spirit, with that first move.
Thanks very much. Next question.
Hello, my name is Evan Grayer. I'm a junior at Harvard College. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Levy and Mr. Masri. Many people have described the end of the Persian Gulf War as a window of opportunity for solving both the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more specifically. My question is, when Israeli and Jordanian idealists imagine their own new world order, what place in it do they see for the Palestinians? Ideally, what would Israelis and what would Jordanians like to see the future of the Palestinians be?
Mr. Masri?
Well, I think that Jordan would say that a Palestinian state with a democratic Palestinian state, elected representatives, etc. And I think for the sake of economic soundness, that state would have to be very closely cooperating with Jordan, maybe a confederation. Really, I think that it would be such a bold step. I really don't know what would happen. I think that though the idea is that it would be a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Well, I'd see the relationships as living together in peace, side by side, gradually building confidence based on the differences and the gaps which are already between us. I would see it rather than a state. I would see the Palestinians enjoying a great degree of determining their own future, short of statehood, for the simple reason that in our judgment, the area we're talking about, if you're referring, for example, to the area of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria and Gaza, you're talking about a size of a county in the state of Massachusetts, let's say Worcester County. In our opinion, a state, an independent state between us and Jordan would probably be detrimental to our security. I would take issue with my colleague here. I would not think that in all likelihood it would be democratic, for the simple reason, I'm afraid to say, that none of our neighboring Arab states are democratic in the tradition that we know democracy. So most likely, if a state like that were to emerge, it would be on the style of some of our neighboring states. It would probably, if we would follow the subscription offered by some tonight, it would be led by people like Arafat, Kaddoumi and others. We know who they've aligned themselves with in recent months, and the pronouncements they have made, which is a far cry than whatever was ascribed to them by my colleague 2 years ago. And therefore I would suspect that they would follow a more radical line and be rather detrimental to Israel's security. Therefore, to sum up, we would see the Palestinians living side by side next to us, enjoying a great degree of freedom, enjoying determination of their own future, save of statehood.
Next question.
My name is Simon Sachs. My question is to the members of the panel, if they could give a current assessment of their country's views towards Syria and what future views or possibilities are in the short term, and how that view could change if President Assad were to pass away.
Let me start with Kurt.
Well, I think there's a temptation, I hope it will be resisted, to use Syria as the next Arab state that would be the go-between between Israel. I'm concerned because I think the domestic politics of Syria are much closer to Iraq than perhaps any other state in the world. It is probably as far away from democratic rule and even any kind of open representation in any country in the Middle East. I think it's fine that we have a degree of dialogue. I think it's useful that we try to convince Mr. Assad about how dangerous certain kinds of terrorism are. I'm concerned about some process which will bestow a kind of legitimacy on the Syrian leadership that I think in the long run might have some very serious consequences. I mean, a number of different military moves have gone on in the last several months. One that has not gone noticed as much has been very aggressive and very successful Syrian military moves inside of Lebanon.
Anybody else in my panel like to add to that? Yes, Jakob?
Well, I guess as Syria is our neighbor, I would characterize Syria as historically the most severe adversary of Israel, has participated in most wars against us. If Israel feels a threat from the Arab world, it is primarily from Syria, which today has, after Iraq's arsenal has been decimated, has the largest arsenal in the Arab world, something like 4,000 tanks and so forth. However, Syria having reached an agreement with Israel in '74, has basically kept it with very few infractions for the last 17 years. The differences between us and Syria, aside from the ones in principle of recognition and acceptance of our existence, are the question primarily of the Golan Height, a small strip of land overlooking the north of Israel, very important strategically from our point of view, and I guess from their point of view, and indirectly the issue of Lebanon, where Syria would like to maintain and increase its hegemony. I think that very much like Iraq, Syria has been paying lip service to the Palestinian cause, but I would hazard to say that in the same manner that Saddam Hussein championed the Palestinian cause after August 3rd, but dumped it at the first opportunity when he was bidding for a ceasefire, that there is a similar likelihood that although the Syrians would speak highly on behalf of the Palestinians, that if they would begin a process of negotiations with us, they would do what they did in 1982 or 93, and that is not be willing to make any concrete, perhaps not be willing to make concrete moves on behalf of the Palestinians. The Syrians don't subscribe to a recognition of the PLO in the same way as others. In fact, they've established competing organizations headed by Abu Musa, and you know that Arafat has not been a welcome guest in Syria for a number of years now.
Yes, I share the skepticism strongly towards Assad and the regime. But I think to look ahead and into the future, one must see what changes have taken place now. I think there are two basic experiences in the region which are new to the people. One basic experience to the Israelis is that in their analysis, they had always been alone in the final hour, so to speak. And they knew one day maybe Syria might be attacking and Israel might be again alone. And that's why Israel didn't really listen to others and said, well, you can't help us. You are telling us and talking, but this time Israel has the experience that there are final hours in the regions when Israel is not alone. So I think this reduces tension vis-à-vis fears from Syria. On the other hand, Syria and the Syrian political class or whatever there is and remains in power has experienced something which they didn't experience so far, that in certain situations Israel did not retaliate. The non-retaliation of Israel is a new experience to the region. So these two factors should be used, at least. And of course, you mentioned Lebanon. One shouldn't make the things as complicated as they are, talking about them, but one can't come to a final peace, a lasting peace, not final, without asking the question of what is the future of Lebanon. And there, Syria has a lot to tell us about the handling of the Lebanese situation.
Mr. Masri.
Well, fortunately, not being the representative of a government or in any semi-official function whatsoever, I can speak my mind on this issue. Syria is as bad as Iraq is to here. I mean, the same methods, exactly the same thing. And yet, surprisingly enough, the Allies jumped in bed with Syria because it was convenient. And I'm very sorry to see that, and I think that you will see in a bit that Syria will be presenting the same kind of problem that Iraq presented.
There is a great danger. Syria looks as if she's rearming already. Now, we've got 3 other questioners, and I would ask each of them to say who they would like to answer the question, because we can probably deal with all of them, but I would ask my panel to be brief. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, yes, you were next.
My name is David Rush. I'm a professor of public health at Tufts, and I have a comment and then a question, primarily, I think, for Mr. Campbell. The comment is just a brief one on the casualties and the human destruction. There is a new chapter of Médecins du Monde being formed in the United States, and in conjunction with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, we are organizing volunteer help to go both to refugee camps in Jordan and, if possible, Iran, as well as to
Iraq.
No, refugees in Iran, if we can get in, but also as soon as we can get into Iraq and Kuwait. And I should say that we've had desperate trouble on finding out what casualties there are and what the environmental consequences of the bombing of both the chemical and the nuclear plants have been, since both of the parties in the war have it to do not wish this information to be disseminated for obvious reasons. That's the comment. The question is to Mr. Campbell. There were seemed 2 basic reasons to try to negotiate and settle this conflict peacefully. One is so as not to kill people, and there were many of us who felt that the barrier, that the biblical injunction not to kill was reached and discarded much too briefly. But the other major reason was that we were told we would have the enmity of the Arab masses for 100 years possibly from the amount of massive killing that the Allies caused. Could you please comment on this? None of you have really talked. You've talked about America's credibility and the leverage we have in the region, and many of us heard for
I think
weeks.
We have the questions.
Yeah.
Excuse me. There are other people who want to ask questions. Kurt.
Okay. First of all, I was one who was for the continued use of sanctions, and I was also for the continuing, once the war had begun, of the air campaign. And I'd be the first to say that I was wrong on both counts, I think. I don't believe, and I was wrong, and I don't think Iraq would have backed down under sanctions. And I also think that the time came in the context of the war where the military leadership made the right choice to go ahead with the ground war. I was tremendously concerned, but frankly more about our casualties than I was about Iraqi casualties at that stage. I'll say one of the things that I'm most concerned about from the American perspective is an honest and open accounting about what happened after the war, what's happened during the war. There has been, as you point out, a clear desire to steer away from the question of casualties. And I think that we've made this case that there is a difference, particularly in the Iraqi case, between soldier and civilian. But we must remember that most of these, and frankly they're not much more than kids that were conscripted into the army and put on the open down in the front, had very little choice in this matter. And in that respect, it is nothing more than a tragedy. And I would agree with you. And I do hope that there will be a very honest assessment of where things stand. One of the things that we have seen is that the British and the Saudis have been very forthcoming about what they estimate to be certain casualties. One of the problems at this stage, frankly, is that there is not a lot of information. There is a tremendous difficulty in getting good, solid information.
What about our long-term leverage in the region?
Okay, I was going to get to that. Out of what's going on inside of Iraq and even inside the Kuwaiti theater. I think another one of the myths, we've seen so many shattered by this war. One of them, for instance, is this question of whether territory matters, whether narrow strips of territory have anything to do with security if you can be bombarded by missiles. And I think that will be a process that will play itself out within the Israeli community. The other thing that I think has been laid to rest is that the notion is that there is some sort of Arab street that extends in some manner from Pakistan all the way to Algeria or Morocco. Every single country behaved in a different way, in a dramatically different way. And so it would be impossible to suggest that there was one single Arab reaction, first of all. Second of all, it's impossible to say the nature of at this stage. I think we are still sorting through what some of the lessons are. If I would make my own assessment, I think that the country that will most heavily perhaps see how the Gulf War has shaped its internal politics would be Jordan.
Kurt, can I cut you off there because
Yes.
we've got two final questions. I'm going to ask the respondents to be very brief. You and Csce.
Thank you. My name is Chris Brangle, and I'd like to address this question to Professor Williams and Campbell. I thought it'd be good to bring attention back to Iraq, since that's where most of the war happened. We've been mostly talking about Israel and the Palestinians, which is fine. But in terms of Iraq, what I've been hearing recently is that there might be some form of revolution going on in Basra. Apparently the government has lost control, or it's not quite clear what's going on. I was wondering if you could comment on that. And also, if you could comment on perhaps the relationship between Iraq and its neighbors. There's some talk that maybe Syria or Iran or Turkey at some point might try to take off a piece here and there, and what the chances of that are, do you think?
Well, one word, and then I'll hand it over to Kurt for one word. First of all, I think there's some clear evidence that some of the fundamentalist forces, who in a sense were hidden by Saddam Hussein giving the impression that he was in a sense a holy war leader, where he had never been that before, the Ba'ath Party was a deeply secular party, are now beginning to exert themselves in parts of Iraq which are not clearly under his control. How far that will get, I don't know, but Basra was always a city which was somewhat affected by fundamentalism. And secondly, I think on the issue of Iraq and her neighbours, there was some concern, not least in Germany, I think, that President Ozal had rather wider ambitions than simply to be a good ally in the war, that he was dreaming of the Ottoman Empire being reborn. And for him, the interesting thing, of course, was that he didn't carry the support of much of his people. There was not strong support for the position that he took. And my own feeling is that he is now in a rather exposed position, though obviously he's benefited from the relatively short, successful war that's occurred. Kurt.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Shirley said, there will be quite a bit of pressure from the Allies to guarantee Iraq's political and territorial integrity at this stage, particularly territorial integrity. The difficult issue, frankly, at this stage is the extent of Iran's support of indigenous Shia religious groups, particularly in the south, that appear to be gaining quite a bit of political support. And it's, I mean, again, information coming out of Basra and the area around Basra is fragmented at this stage. However, we do know that perhaps the most powerful Iraqi government or group in exile is in Tehran, is in Iran, and they were called to Tehran after the first flights of airplanes left Iraq and landed. It appeared that the first flights were more exodus rather rapidly, and then subsequently perhaps part of a negotiated framework. What we have had, frankly, is a lot of private arms flowing into the region. One of the things we have seen is clear evidence of Iranian support for, again, these indigenous groups inside Iraq. And frankly, as also we found quite a bit of extensive evidence of Jordanian support for the Iraqis, something that we haven't touched on, but is very clear, and it sort of belies other more public statements.
I'll take the last question, and I'll ask my panel each to address it in about 2 sentences. Please.
Yes, my name is Imad Fakhouri. I'm a first-year MPP student at the Kennedy School. My question is to Ambassador Levy. I just would like to ask you, how could you call that, in your vision of a future of Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, call that a great deal of freedom when Israel, and Your Excellency as a representative of Israel, still denies them the basic rights of self-determination, having their own identity, and most importantly, having a homeland? Thank you.
Jakob, you're going to get a couple of minutes to answer that. No, 1 minute.
Fine, I'll answer it briefly. I would answer it simply and briefly. It is our desire, as much as a desire of our neighbors and our Palestinian neighbors, to move away from the current situation in which indeed both sides are suffering, to move into a new direction in which Israelis will enjoy a greater sense of security and Palestinians will enjoy a greater sense of freedom and a greater sense of self-expression. So I would agree with you that the current situation is far from optimal, that both sides are suffering. I'd see also the Israeli side, of course. But our proposal is move away from it into a better situation and try and eliminate these degrees of suffering and gain some achievement for both sides.
Just a sentence from the rest of my panel. Freimuth? Anything you'd like to add?
I would like to come back to one point which we did not discuss, that is the role of the United Nations. I think if the world would come back to this glorious moment, that for the first time in history it was the United Nations which stood together and said we must do something. This idea of the role of the United Nations has somehow disappeared during the last month, and I think we have to, and we have a strong debate on this in our country, on the role of the General Secretary, of the question of whether in the future conflicts there may be a political high command doing more of the steering business, which in this recent crisis has been taken over more or less by one nation. And I think we have to come back to the point when the United Nations gathered that new momentum last August. And I very much hope that we will have a deep discussion on its role, especially on the role of the new General Secretary. There will be a new General Secretary next year.
Michel?
Well, just the Jordanian position, I guess, once more, but very, very, very briefly. There will be no lasting peace unless a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict is found, and unless the disparity between the rich Arabs and the poor Arabs is erased.
Kurt?
I'd just like to say that there will be no lasting peace, first of all. And that's quite frank. I think that this is going to be a much longer process. I think that we have to be clear. We're not talking about shaping or molding clay. We're talking about chipping away at granite. Much of what we've heard today are opening, going in positions. They will change. That's the nature of negotiations. I think the key is to begin the process, perhaps not to begin the process with dramatic utopian schemes, but perhaps even incremental steps. That would be my lesson and what I would how I would approach the region at this stage. Thank you.
That's probably right. It's also rather sad, and I can only say one optimistic thing to conclude this evening. To me, it's really rather a remarkable thing that I sit on the same platform as Freimuth Douve after 2 world wars ripped us apart and think of him as my fellow citizen of Europe. So things can change, and it's always worth hanging on to that. Thank you to my panel. Thank you to the audience.